I think we've got a fascinating afternoon in prospect, and we're starting with a slightly different format. We thought for a change, we would do this next session as a conversation, dialogue between Helen and Paul. Very pleased to welcome Helen Carr. I think it's the first time that you've spoken at one of our conferences. I think some of you I've already seen have bought Helen's book, which Paul is holding up, Sceptred Isle, and I saw a queue forming for people who wanting Helen to sign a copy. So Sceptred Isle, A New History of the 14th Century, which featured on the Times books to look out for in 2025 and became a top 10 Times bestseller list on its publication. And Helen is currently working on her doctorate in medieval history at Queen Mary University, London, which is a completely different focus to our normal interests, with our interest being on the March of Wales. Then Helen's interest and focus is going to be on the English-Scottish border in the 14th century. So Helen and Paul, and Paul needs very little introduction because you all know him as the president of the Mortimer History Society and medieval specialist at the National Archives. And in planning today, we thought that one of the key themes that runs through the 13th and 14th century is that people who were the subjects of the crown came back time and again to wrestle with the problem of how to respond to a king who was weak and ineffectual, or to one who showed despotic tendencies, or indeed, in some cases, veered from one extreme to the other. And obviously, the talks this morning in terms of the period of Magna Carta and the barons wrestling with the problem of how they dealt with King John, and then through to the period in the mid-13th century, the period of baronial reform and rebellion under his son Henry III, where again the barons rebelled against the king. And as we know, in 1264, following the Battle of Lewes, Henry III and the royal family were captured, and Simon de Montfort became the effective ruler of the country, with Henry under his control and just rubber stamping what happened. A big what if, of course, is what would have happened if that had continued, and would indeed Henry's life have been shortened. That didn't happen, as we know, and at the Battle of Evesham, the royal forces were victorious. But the problem of how people dealt with a tyrannical, ineffective, bad king continued into the 14th century, and next came into focus during the reign of Edward II. So I'll now hand over to Helen and to Paul, who in conversation will talk about how people responded and how the approaches evolved and developed.
Okay, is my mic on?
I think
brilliant. Okay, well, hello everybody in the room. Hello everybody online. Welcome back. This is an experiment, so do bear with us. We've never done this before. We hope it's going to work, and we are obviously going to spend time for questions from the audience, both online and in the room later on. Hopefully, we're going to have provoke some questions from you as well. So obviously, this morning, we've heard from the leading authorities in the world, obviously, on 13th century, on Magna Carta. We've heard a lot about the law, the Constitution, and Parliament, and rightly so. Helen, in her brilliant new book, which I'm going to plug again, Sceptred Isle, do please buy, £25, possibly cheaper in the room. Helen talks about history's human experience and how she's written a lot of the characters that appear in her book. She's tried to write them with sort of humanity and empathy. And to kind of explore personality as a contribution to politics, law, in the period in which she's talking about, the 14th century. So our task is really to discuss how subjects attempted to deal with and restrain monarchs. As you know, the 14th century sees 2 depositions, although one, of course, is dressed up as an abdication, and also possibly the murder of 2 anointed sovereigns. Whereas we also have, sandwiched between them, probably England's most revered medieval monarch, who some would argue tried to create what we might call a kind of a community of mutual interest that Andrew was really trying to tease out earlier. What we want to start with, I think, is not just what made a bad king, but of course there are episodes where kings are not actually in charge of their own destiny, particularly as we talked about in the Mod 14 period, but in the minority of Edward III. So I'm going to ask Helen, just if we can start with kind of what made a bad ruler, let's say, rather than a bad king, in the period in which we're talking about.
Thank you, Paul, and thank you for the kind praise and for everybody for having me here. It really is wonderful to be here, and I'm a big fan of the Society, and I've spoken quite a lot about Roger Mortimer in my book, and so it's wonderful to be here on the Welsh marches rather than the Scottish ones for once. But I think that is a good question, and I like the fact that you've picked up on my attempt to draw humanity and empathy. And I think that firstly, I want to start with this is a history book that is written from a writer's perspective as well as a historian's perspective. And I'm going to deviate very slightly to the author of How to Train Your Dragon, Cressida Cowell, because I took my daughter to a literary event last weekend, and she was talking about being a writer, and she was saying that to be a good writer, you need to have empathy for your characters. You need to have empathy and insight into the way that people work and the way their minds work. And I wanted to apply that really in my writing of this book. And so much of that writing, I am talking about these kings and these rulers. And so to answer your question, I think the difference between a good king and a bad king is separating the role of king and the ego. And that's something that I would say certainly 2 kings in the 14th century utterly failed to do. They allow their own insecurities and their own ego to detract from the God-given role of kingship, and how this is meant to be separate to the person who is doing that governing. It's something that you are supposed to respect and perform for the realm, not the realm necessarily performing for you.
Just as a quick response, I wonder, David's also in the audience, he talked about this earlier. How do you empathise with somebody who's been described as a shit? I mean, Edward II, Richard II are the same, aren't they? Really, they are in their own time. They become tyrannical. How, as a modern author, do you empathise with? Let's go back to Edward II's reign, when there are plausible reports of widows, for example, having their limbs broken by the king's henchmen. How do you empathise with that as you're trying to understand why things go wrong and what lies behind the individual as well as the king?
Well, I think it's important not to conflate empathy with trying to make this person likable. Empathizing is trying to take a broader view as to what created that monster. What were the steps that were taken, or the things done, or the experiences that person had that resulted in this particular outcome? And for me, Edward II is fascinating to watch his trajectory into what was called his tyranny in the latter part of his reign.
Okay, so let's talk about legacy, what an inheritance. So we've got 3 kings we're going to talk about here. So Edward II, Edward III, Richard II. Obviously, 2 of them, Edward II and Richard, are the successors of what were at the time and subsequently have been deemed good, successful kings. Edward III is the successor of the man who, even by John's standards, is probably potentially the weakest of all English kings. How do you read into the youth of these people, the legacy that they're getting? What influence does that bring, do you think?
I think it's incredibly important. I mean, we're looking at the legacy and the reign of Edward I. He was an incredibly military-minded king. He also had a fierce temper. I think he would have been a very difficult father. We know that he didn't exactly treat his son with kindness, and if some of the chronicles are to be believed, there's that more apocryphal account of him ripping a chunk out of his son's hair. And whether that's true or not, what it does is it gives us an idea of what he was like as a man, and I think he was quite terrifying. And as a result, it's not outside the realms of possibility that Edward was severely impacted by this. I think it drastically knocked his confidence. I don't think he naturally necessarily had the qualities that a king in the early 14th century might require, and perhaps his father required him to be. But I think that it was his father's heavy-handedness. I think it was the legacy that his father left as being an incredibly successful king and conqueror. He died en route to Scotland to continue his attack on the Scots, and I think those are hard. It's a difficult act to follow, and the pressure that was put on Edward, even though he wasn't a very young man, he was a young man, he wasn't a boy by any means. I think the pressure to continue this mantle of Hammer of the Scots, I think, was enormous, and I don't think he ever really had the qualities in order to be able to do that naturally. But his ultimate failing was because he didn't have this confidence. He relied on others to give it to him. And it was his choice of those others that was ultimately the real failure in his kingship.
Okay. I mean, so let's contrast that with Edward III, say, who does rely on others, but it's a much more, I think as Andrew would describe it, consensual method of governing, isn't it? Where do you think Edward III, what are his main influences that take him in a different direction?
Edward III, I think, is incredibly interesting when we're thinking about his minority and we're thinking about his youth, because he is so in the wings for a lot of his early life. But what he is doing is he is observing. He's observing everything that is going wrong. He's observing the actions of his father and his mother. I think that all of his interest in Arthurianisms, the legacy of Arthur and his model of kingship actually in many ways comes from his mother as well as his grandfather. And I think he sees what not to do with his father. He's a keen observer of people, and I think he starts to get an understanding of what makes a successful ruler. Thinking on the rise of Robert Bruce around the time of the decline of Edward II, this is something that Edward III was observing and witnessing, and I think that he possibly, this is complete conjecture, but I think he possibly had a level of respect for Bruce's kingship, even though he didn't want him to. Yeah. He didn't want him to be king. He wanted Scotland to. He was pro the legacy of his grandfather in that respect. But I think that he saw how Bruce managed to unite most of his nobility and have a incredibly successful reign beginning on rocky ground. So I think Edward he had the opportunity to observe and start afresh from multiple different resources.
Okay, now we've discussed things earlier. We've discussed this many times. You've got Edward III's influences. Now, traditionally, of course, most people see his influences as being Edward I.
Yeah.
And so that sort of, I mean, Edward I he's a prickly figure, but he does bring, as Andrew was kind of intimating, bring people along with him in the way that his father doesn't.
Yeah.
But I've often thought that Edward is a teenager in the 30s, and during the minority, Edward is an impressionable teenager. I'm speaking to an audience at the Mortimer History Society here, so I'm going to take you with me on this one. I personally think that one of the greatest influences on Edward III as a consensual king who enjoys the spectacle and bringing people together with theatre, display, martial feats, etc., doesn't just come from learning about his feats of his grandfather, but it is exactly what his mother, and he sees his mother and Roger Mortimer doing. So 1329, Mortimer brings the court to Wigmore. There is a tournament there. They spend weeks acting out, supposedly, game of the Society of Cradock. All of this kind of Arthurian stuff, which Edward then takes on. I mean, I personally would see a greater influence for Roger Mortimer himself and his mother and Isabella on Edward than is often being given credit for. And again, I wonder whether, for example, let's look at Richard II. Obviously, he wouldn't have known his grandfather particularly well. He would have had his own grandfather and his father's legacy, the Black Prince's legacy, but also he's got his uncle in the background, John of Gaunt. So there are these other influences that on these individuals that sometimes are maybe not forgotten about, obviously, but maybe play a lesser role.
I think so. I think Richard is a slightly different case in this respect, because I think Richard is a law unto himself in many ways, because he comes to the role of king with an entirely different perspective of king. I talked at the beginning how king and person are separate entities. Richard doesn't see it that way. Richard sees him as very much divinely appointed, but not only being divinely appointed, he is divine in himself. It's in Richard's reign that he wants for the first time to be addressed as Your Majesty or Your Highness. And when I think about source material of what I look, the sources I use in relation to the books that I write, I obviously use the archive and the record, but I also like to look at art history and what the visual culture that remains. And in the reign of Richard II, there is some of the most fantastic visual culture that tells us a lot about Richard and how he considered himself as king, the image that he wanted to project. Obviously, the two major examples being the Wilton diptych and the Westminster portrait. And the Wilton diptych does give you, I think, an insight into how Richard saw himself, not just in his youth, but through his life. He saw himself, and I think other people in turn started to see him like this as well, as almost this innocent victim of anything that, anything that happened that was wrong against him. He was pure. He was untouchable. In many ways, like a child. And John of Gaunt, you mentioned Gaunt as being an influence. Gaunt was incredibly astute, and he knew that when Richard was acceding the throne after following the footsteps of Edward III, another huge act to follow, he had to create Richard, he had to paint Richard in a different light. And you just have to look at his coronation and the themes in his coronation. It was white, it was pure, it was innocent, it was godly, and it was divine. And he wanted to create this image of kingship that was not necessarily following this legacy of militarism and conquest, but something that was wholly divine. But Richard, that was to protect Richard, I think, in his youth. But I think Richard really took that into adulthood, and that became a problem because that sort of twisted into this sort of sense of incredible narcissism.
Yeah, and I think he is known to be a megalomaniac and a narcissist, isn't he?
Exactly.
Alleged. Yeah. So I mean, staying with Richard, kind of. I mean, how do we feel about a king who comes to the throne so young, and there's clearly his kingship is often predicated on his personality and his world view of how he sees himself. How do things like his relationship with his magnates, and ultimately, as Andrew mentioned earlier, the fact that there is an actual popular revolt during his reign in a way there isn't in the previous reigns. How do we square that circle?
I think Richard is the only king that can turn a popular revolt into something about him. In that moment and I really do think it was the moment that he addressed the rebels at Mile End in 1381, that he stepped into kingship. Because I think importantly, his uncle wasn't there. And I think that Gaunt's presence and his very level-headed diplomacy, I think Richard found quite stifling, and he was existing under Gaunt's shadow for a lot of the early part of his reign, and I think it allowed him to step into his kingship with mettle, But it's an interesting approach to this would be considering this moment of crisis as a trigger for Richard's narcissism. It's how he is able to act with a clear head in a moment of crisis, but it fill his ego and his cup to extraordinary levels that you see what he does afterwards. It's important to think what he did after the rebellion and the punitive measures he put in place against the people who did rebel against him, which were incredibly punitive.
Yeah, so I mean, you think that that's the trigger to Richard's tyrannical behaviour?
He likes to feel in control.
It's a similar, switch in
absolutely.
Personality, a switch in activity.
I think so. Similar circumstances, the famous duel between Mowbray and Bolingbroke, what does Richard do? He allows it to get to a certain point, and he stops the duel as it is about to start. And this is a duel that has been in the making for months. Can you imagine if you'd travelled from Europe to see this duel? And Richard then says, stop, it's not going to happen. But that is his way of imposing his kingly control over a situation and ultimately not allowing anybody else to take centre stage in that moment. It had to be him. So he's a very different character than Edward II.
I mean, kingly control under Edward II is very different. I mean, Edward isn't able really to assert what you might call kingly control of the nation that you just talked about with Richard until 1321, really, until he actually shows himself militarily capable of leading successful campaign against his enemies, and then ruthlessly, getting rid of his key baronial opponents, and then, of course, how should we put this? Rewriting what the community of the realm was from 1322 to the end of his reign, which of course ended his reign in terrible circumstances.
And this is where you can see, if we can call it a trajectory of Edward's reign, because he begins, I think, naively with appointing Piers Gaveston as Earl of Cornwall.
Yeah.
Yes.
So having Piers as a close advisor and friend, I don't think it's naive at all. I mean, Edward I brought him into court, but it's the excess favour that's been shown.
Yes, and we've looked at that document together in quite close detail. And what you see in the document is beautiful document decorated with these.
We should say what it is. It's the charter by which Edward II endows Piers Gaveston with the earldom of Cornwall in 1307. It's got lovely sort of chuffs on the top.
But what's interesting is he's so new to the role of king. He does this almost immediately after his father's death, and he has to use his father's seal, which I think is an incredible visual statement in itself. But what you also see on this charter is you have Edward's arms, you've got Gaveston's arms, and then you've got Margaret de Clare's arms as well. And Edward is making a real statement saying, this is my family. And I think there's like a winged eagle that is spreading its wings over the arms of Gaveston and the de Clare arms, and that I think is an incredibly powerful device, is him indicating these are the people who are my family. And I think that's how he saw Piers Gaveston. I think he saw him as a brother and as family. But it's interesting also to see who the signatories on that charter. You have the Earl of Lancaster. You have many of the noblemen who then penalised Gaveston. Many of them who were there at the show trial that Gaveston faced moments before, within a short period before his execution. And then after that, you see a shift in Edward, but also this gap that he needed to fill. And we're coming up to 1322, don't worry. But there's this gap that he needed to fill. And I always think that when it comes to Edward and his favourites, it's a bit like whack-a-mole. You get rid of one, and another one just springs up again, and that's
not just one.
Not just one, and that's sort of what happens in between the death of Piers Gaveston in 1312 and Boroughbridge in 1322. But the problem is with removing Gaveston, who was reckless and foolish and arrogant, and had nicknames for the nobility and lots of other people. He was rude, conceited, but what he's replaced by, I think, one of the worst men in medieval history, and that is Hugh Despenser the Younger. And the the absolute ambition of Hugh Despencer the Younger and his ability to manipulate Edward is extraordinary. And you really see this shift in who Edward becomes. But I think, and you said, Edward shows a level of power and his shift in power. Is it his power or is it Despencer's power? That's the question. And I think looking at Edward as a character, looking at how generous and gentle actually he could be, and then you see his change and his paranoia increase. And I think it's Hugh Despencer that has a lot to answer for. And I think a good way of evidencing this is when we were working together, there was, in the record, it was actually took quite a lot of research to find out what this was. We found out the word, this Secrasia harnasia, which was in Edward's wardrobe account, I think.
Yeah,
and
it's not an issue roll.
No, I think it was an issue roll.
Yes,
and
the roll of issues from the Royal Exchequer.
Yes, it was.
Included a payment.
Payment to somebody who
to the
looked
King's
after
armour,
this.
effectively.
Yes, who looked after this Secrasia harnasia, and we couldn't work out what that was. We had quite a few conversations about what that could be.
Was it a
secret harness? It's what it translates to.
Yeah.
So there was some quite sort of fruity conversations over coffee in the cafe at the National Archives about what this could be. But then I was talking to Toby Capwell, who is an expert on armoury, and he thinks it was body armour. So he was probably wearing under his clothes probably some kind of mail vest, which demonstrates how unsettled Edward was. And as we were talking earlier, he would not leave the country, which is how...
Well, I think he was willing to, but Despencer wasn't, and therefore he didn't.
Exactly. But again, that comes into who had the power. And there's another case in the King's Bench record of around 1325 of necromancy. It's a case against...
1323, but
Okay.
Anyway, same.
This is why we have Paul. 1323.
It might be 1325, I can't remember.
But it's a case of necromancy in Coventry, and the objects of the attack were the king and were Hugh Despencer the Younger. So I think people did seem to see Despencer as holding the reins of power, and to see the amount of land that Despencer was able to acquire in a drastically short period of time was deeply concerning. And to push this point further, I think even Isabella saw that. Isabella had, up until this point, actually had a very good relationship with Edward. She'd had a good relationship with Gaveston. When she left for France, and there was this exchange of letters, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with, between herself and the Archbishop, I think, she claimed she was afraid, and that's often been interpreted as, hysteria. She's trying to be dramatic. She's proving a point. I actually disagree. I think she really was afraid of Hugh Despencer the Younger and what he was capable of. And we know what he was capable of because there's evidence from his trial as to everything that he did to particularly to women. And so I think she had just reason to be afraid. So when we're thinking about Edward, and I've probably massively deviated from your question, I apologise, Paul.
Fine. As I said, this was a free-flowing conversation.
Yes, it's a test to see how this goes. But what I think the point is Edward gave away his power to those who sought to exercise it to their own advantage.
Yeah. Now, I'm not going to disagree with you, but there are quite famous books on the reign of Edward II, particularly by Natalie Fried, Mark Buck, which actually give a lot more agency to Edward himself, particularly on the financial side. It's Edward the one who's actually pressing the Exchequer to raise more cash. It's his voice, it's by the mouth of the king or whatever. It's not Despencer. So Edward is, there's strong record evidence that Edward is actually as much involved in the day-to-day business of tyranny, shall we say, as the Despensers. But I completely agree. I mean,
I don't disagree with that at all. I think that's absolutely the case. But what we do know is that Edward is quite easily manipulated.
Oh, yeah.
So even though it is coming from his own voice, I think it's also with a good level of arm twisting and gentle persuasion by Hugh Despenser.
If I'm right, David, I think you say in the book about Henry III that Henry sometimes he would respond to the last person who said something to him, and he would agree with that, and it would change his mind. And I think Edward might see Edward similarly, in that he would take the most recent piece of advice and go with that until somebody told him something. You thought, oh well, obviously I should go with that.
Yeah,
he wasn't constant, shall we say?
He wasn't constant, but I also think in that case we need to think about his relationship, and coming back to the point of the conversation, his relationship with his barons. If that were the case, would he not then take heed? What would be the point of the ordinances to a certain extent? Would he not take heed from Lancaster? Would he not listen to Warwick? No, he didn't. I think he needed a sense of security and kinship with somebody on a much more personal level than just having this select group of noblemen or councillors. I think he needed this sense of love, fraternity, and a very powerful bond with a person.
Sorry, just a sort of a small aside, which may or may not be relevant. Of course, in 1297, the individual who gives the 1297 Magna Carta, it is issued by Edward as Keeper of the Realm. So he's literally front and centre as this great constitutional document is reconfirmed by the great baronial movement against his father. So he obviously sees the power of the political community and what they can bring against the monarch. And it's interesting that in his reign, as I think Scott Waugh has recently written about, it's not Magna Carta that becomes the touchstone of constitutional change. And throughout the 14th century, again, Magna Carta it's not in the way that it is in the 13th century, the thing that people go back to. So it's in 1310-11, the Lords Ordainer are constituted, elected, and they produce the ordinances against him and his government. But the difference, of course, is that the ordinances do single out individual, named individuals in a way that Magna Carta doesn't, if I'm right.
Yes, I think Magna Carta created this sort of political culture of resistance that enabled the platform of the ordinances. But the ordinances are incredibly specific to Edward. And I think that is the difference. And we've looked at them together for a documentary.
History, check it out.
And there is one particular clause that names Piers Gaveston, which you wouldn't get in Magna Carta.
As David was showing in his slide, in the margin, it actually does say concerning Piers Gaveston.
Yes, it does. It does. I'm sorry, we didn't bring that, but there is I think I have a picture of it somewhere because it's very clear. And it talks about also how Edward has to go through the ordainers to grant land. And one of the major issues of Edward as a king is he would just give land to people, and that would cause a huge amount of political unrest, particularly in this region, in the borders. And the Declare inheritance was really the catalyst, I think, for Edward's downfall. I mean, you could even go as far back to say that the death of Gilbert at Bannockburn was the catalyst for Edward's downfall, but that spat over the Declare inheritance and Despenser's rapid accumulation of that land, I think, is demonstrative of Edward just not learning from the ordinances as well. And I think that's also the ordinances in that respect were very much precipitating Edward's late future kingship.
I mean, it's slightly odd. I don't think Edward ever really wanted to, and he wanted to slip the shackle of the ordinances. Although in 1322, when he has actually supreme power, the Statute of York does, although it revokes the ordinances, it does say that we are going to observe the good points of the ordinances and of Magna Carta. So he was aware that there were things that within a constitutional framework that he was happy to accept and that were reasonable, in the same way that other kings were too later on in the century. But ultimately, the whole facade was unacceptable.
Am I right? Didn't Hugh Despenser order somebody to go and remove? There was a reference to the ordinances.
You're talking about the tablet.
The tablet in St Paul.
The one that Lancaster, Thomas Lancaster.
Yes.
He erects in St Paul's Cathedral, and
Hugh Despenser takes it away.
Because it had become a sort of a site of pilgrimage after Thomas of Lancaster had been executed in 1322. So those that were opposing Edward and the Despensers were kind of coalescing around these well, in this case, it was a tablet, a memorial tablet to the ordinances.
That's a strange cult around Thomas of Lancaster, isn't it? If you think back to the sort of political martyrdom of Thomas of Lancaster, where in reality he was not that exciting or radical a person.
No, although of course there is, under Richard, an attempt to canonise Edward.
Yes, exactly. Multiple attempts to canonise Edward. Actually, it's interesting. I mean, I'm sure many of you have been to the tomb of Edward at Gloucester, but there is Richard's white hart symbol. He's almost stamped himself on Edward's tomb because I think he felt like Edward was so hard done by. Little did he know that he's going to face a similar fate.
So shall we? I mean, we're moving towards. Let me just check the time. Yeah, we've still got 10 minutes. Shall we talk about the end of Kings? Now, so I mean, in terms of both deposition and potential murder. So I mean, let's talk about 1326 here. How is it that you can go from a supreme power with no opposition to an invasion launched from overseas with a small number of people, and you get a bloodless coup, and as Andrew talked about, you end up engineering, basically without much effort, really, an unprecedented deposition. Because of course, from a legal point, this is, nobody knows, there is no precedent, really. They're kind of making it up on the fly to some degree. All of this, the Guildhall oath that Mortimer supposedly leads in January.
It's totally on the fly. I think they didn't. I think everything was done, as you say, quite last minute. Even Edward's eventual murder was. I linger on that.
Eventual murder of Edward II. We're not going to discuss this unless you want to ask us about it in questions. It's too controversial. Ian Mortimer's not here, so although he might watch online, so be careful what you say.
I've got to be careful what I say. No, I think his eventual murder. I think everything was done quite last minute. I think Isabella and Mortimer were, and I'd like to come back to the point of their leadership. But I think what Isabella and Mortimer had in their arsenal was the heir to the throne. Without Edward, the future Edward III, I don't think that it would have happened. No. I mean, it was really Edward II's fecklessness in allowing his son to go and pay homage in France on his behalf, and therefore effectively handing him to his mother. And it was Isabella's nous and her ability to create her own allies in Hainault and the Low Countries, and then she was able to create this army. But I don't think initially the idea was to overthrow Edward. It was to overthrow Despenser. And that was what was being propagated in England at the time as well, because Despenser was not a liked person. There were many members of the nobility who wanted to get rid of him. So with an opportunity to do so with the heir to the throne and the Queen, and also Edward's younger brothers at this point as well, I think is important to point out, the Earl of Kent being one of them, who we'll come back to. It wasn't that difficult to do what they did, because they weren't at that point deposing a king. But I think what they were then faced with was this impossible, it was a catch-22, that, well, if Edward is allowed to come back to his power and Isabella is, return to him, Roger Mortimer's not going to fare very well. So it's difficult then, because what do you do with the king? And so they were keeping him under house arrest, and eventually convinced him to relinquish the crown to his son, which he did. But then again, you're faced with the difficult decision of, you have two kings in one realm, and that is going to cause some level of civil war. And this is a period where civil war has consumed so much of English politics up until this point. So I think in some ways they were, especially after the escape attempt from Kenilworth Castle, I think that they were pushed really to make the decision I think Mortimer made the decision to have Edward killed.
I mean, I tend to agree, but we might come back to that shortly. I just going back to Edward II a bit. He makes two fatal mistakes, neither of which are actually mistakes when he makes them, if you see what I mean. The decision not to execute Mortimer and his uncle when he had the chance.
Well, he was going to, wasn't he?
He was going to, but then he was dissuaded from doing it, I think probably because they're good service. But then, as you say, allowing his son to go to France, which actually neither of those are mistakes at the time. I don't think they there wouldn't have been a perception that was a bad decision. But of course, ultimately, with hindsight, we know there were terrible mistakes, and that it ultimately cost Edward his kingship and probably his life as well.
Yeah. But I think also it's important to come back to just, I know we've not got that long, but it's coming into the reign of Edward III and the change and what happened over Mortimer and Isabella's, could we even call it a regency? It's not really.
I mean, no, there was no official
regime. We'll call it their regime. Isabella and Mortimer are a wonderful example of what happens when you achieve great power, but you're so afraid of how you're going to hold on to it, it turns into tyranny, and it turns into this paranoia, turns into cruelty. And they went from this great success of overthrowing Despenser and eventually having to depose Edward, and they now are in power. But the problem is, power taken through bloodletting is only a temporary power, and they spent an extraordinary amount of time and energy trying to hold on to it, and in doing so, they were crushing the potential for the young Edward III. They weren't allowing him to stretch his legs. It was that sort of real push-pull of teenage rambunctiousness and desire to do the job, and also just being pushed down by his mother because she didn't want to let go of the reins, and Mortimer. And what you saw is that tip into this appalling state of cruelty. And I have a motif in the book, and I refer to it a lot, and it's the Wheel of Fortune, which is a contemporary 14th century image and earlier and later. And you have the goddess Fortuna who spins the Wheel of Fortune, and one moment you're at the top of the wheel, and the next moment you're crushed beneath its spokes. And I think this is incredibly applicable to this particular period of time and thinking about Roger Mortimer, because Mortimer is feeling at the apex of his power when he's in Nottingham Castle, and then there is this coup where Edward involves his closest friends, and he quite literally drags Mortimer from Nottingham Castle.
In his pyjamas.
Well,
Metaphorically speaking.
But what was it that triggered him? He's gone from, quietly sitting back, and then he goes into sort of engaging with the Pope about the level of authority he has as king. But I think it was the absolutely appalling act that Mortimer and Isabella, more Mortimer, went with, which was the execution of the Earl of Kent, who Edmund Earl of Kent, father of Joan of Kent, and the imprisonment of his 9 months pregnant wife. And I'm sure many of you are familiar with the episode of the execution of the Earl of Kent, and this is a son of Edward I. Nobody would execute a prince, and so this poor man was made to wait for an executioner to be found. And I think they managed to find somebody who was in prison for some very lowly crime, who was said, well, you can have your freedom if you execute him. And I think that this was the moment that Edward, who was an ardent royalist, he really believed in royal power and authority. I think this was the moment that he thought Mortimer had stepped beyond the pale. And I think after that, it was when he started to want to take back his kingship and his authority, because it was an extraordinary act on Mortimer's behalf, I think.
Yeah, and this is where we have to kind of talk about the potential background to this. This is does Edward Earl of Kent, well, he believes his brother is still alive. So the context of this is that somebody, somewhere, has let it be known that the late King Edward of Carnarvon is alive. He could be put back on the throne, which at the time, of course, with Mortimer and Isabella holding sway, would have been quite attractive to people. And of course there is archival evidence that the Archbishop of York, for example, believed in this coup. There are about 50, 60 people who are arrested as part of the plot, the supposed plot.
Yeah.
So there is also in the background of the whole of the early part of Edward III's reign, and actually even up to potentially 1339, when this chap William the Welshman, William Wallace, turns up in Cologne and says, I am your father. Not quite, but Edward, I am your father, and then disappears again, possibly to Italy, whatever. I mean, there is that spectre, and I guess it's difficult for us to get into the young Edward's head as to how on earth you, as a teenager, you reconcile the fact your mother as potentially, you thought, your father had died of natural causes, whatever. All of a sudden, it's been made known that he might not be, and your uncle has been killed for being part of a conspiracy to free your father, who might then take your throne.
I think it's very likely that was a trap set.
Oh, sure, yeah.
Set by Mortimer to try and wheedle out who was loyal to him, to Isabella, less to Edward III, but to him and Isabella predominantly. And it was a cruel trap. But I wonder how much equally Edward believed that to be the case as well. And talking about the later part of his reign, when he is visited and said, "I'm your father," we've talked about his reaction to that, and he said, "Well, why didn't he arrest him? Why didn't he interrogate him?" And I said, because it's possible that he saw he was a madman.
Yeah.
And what do you do you're not going to arrest a madman.
Edward II, of course, has John of Powderham executed.
Well, yes.
So?
But I don't think that he really believed it. I think that's why. I think that's why there was a level of just inaction. I don't think that it was because I don't think there was any sort of plausible reality to it.
No. Okay, well, I think we should move towards a conclusion before we open up to questions. So let's return to the main topic about how you restrain a bad king or a bad ruler. What do you think, if you were writing a guide to a 14th century magnate, what would you say to them that they should attempt?
To the magnate or the king?
Yeah, not to the king, because
Okay,
the king is the target of this.
Okay.
How would you rein in a bad king or a bad ruler, say?
Well, I think that was quite well done in 1225. No, I think I would say.
But of course, Henry technically is not an adult at that point, is he? So
No,
it's
I
slightly
suppose.
different,
But I would say that. Well, I think they had a good go at it with the ordinances, and I think that everything that they everything that was written in the ordinances was reasonable. I think I might reframe that to enable me to answer this more clearly, in that what do I think is a king's role should be, and how a king and the magnates should maintain peace and order in the realm in relation to civil, political unrest. And I would say that is adhering to that structure of kingship, which is modelled to be the successful mode of hierarchy. So hierarchy being important in this period. You have the king, and then you have your magnates, and then you have the knights beneath, and then you have the other classes below. I think this sort of idea of the king and the council of magnates working together with the king as an ultimate ruler is the most effective means of achieving that. Because when you look at the 14th century, and I'm going to apply this to the 14th century because I can't answer in great detail elsewhere, but if you look at Edward II and Richard II, with Edward, he takes Piers Gaveston and he elevates him into this class of nobility. And later with Richard II, you see a similar action with Robert de Vere, his favourite. When you start bypassing these ancient noble families, these incredibly powerful lords who actually are the gatekeepers to the realm in so many ways, that is when you are destabilizing the hierarchy of kingship and political order. And so I would say you need to adhere to this structure, because that structure is there for a purpose. And it's the purpose that is ultimately more important than the ego.
So what you're saying really is teamwork makes the dream work.
Of course.
Edward III knew what he was doing, didn't he?
Yeah, he did. Absolutely. He's a classic example of how that worked brilliantly. Yeah.
Okay, Philip, you've got the mic, haven't you? I don't know, but we're open for questions. So anybody, obviously that was, as you say, an experiment. It was extremely rambling. I grant you. Andrew's got his hand up. Oh dear, that's a bad sign.
It's going to say something we've got wrong.
Oh, there'll be plenty of that.
Not at all. I think, first of all, just to thank Helen and Paul, because I don't think that was rambling for a second. It was a fascinating conversation. While I'll take the liberty to ask a question whilst I'm having to walk up to the gods to hand the microphone over to Andrew, so you can be answering a question.
Fine.
Paul referred earlier to how in the 1320s, Roger and Isabella and the people around them were having to work it out on the hoof as they went along, because they were in circumstances that were totally unprecedented. There was nothing to fall back on, and so they're having to work it out on the hoof. By the time we get through to the 1390s, are people drawing on the precedent of the 1320s? Are they making reference to that? Are we seeing a sort of political philosophy developing of this is how you can deal with a bad king?
So there is a parliament held in Salisbury in the 1380s, I think it's late 1380s. No, it is the earlier 1380s, apologies, because John of Gaunt's not in Spain, he's there, where Richard II, is threatened with the memory of the ordinances under Edward II. So I think to some extent, yes, I think there is that spectre. But in relation to Henry Bolingbroke and the deposition of Richard, I think that was the more radical of the two, because that's a true deposition of not only a king, of a linear line of kings. You are ending that accepted line of kings going forward. I mean, Henry, yes, he's a grandson of Edward III. He's the son of John of Gaunt, but he's not the heir, and that's the point. And so I think that was a more radical and a more unsettling act, and that was something that Henry, as we know, Henry IV had to deal with for most of his reign going forward. So I think in some ways, yes, there was a constant mirror into Edward II, but I think that, and actually there is a chapter in the book called Mirror for Kings, which is sort of, or is it Mirror for No, it's Mirror for Kings, which is in reference to that exactly. But no, I think that the actual act of deposition was a different beast.
Thank you both. It was really, really interesting, and I agree absolutely with everything that you said about restraining a king and teamwork and all of that. And actually that the ordinances of 1311 in many ways are not an attempt to restrain Edward, but actually to try to help him to rule. But I wanted to play devil's advocate and actually put the idea that actually in both Edward II and Richard II's reign, it is the decisions of the magnates at the start of the reign which causes everything to go wrong. So take Gaveston, for instance. Edward chooses Gaveston as his counsellor. He chooses him as his closest advisor. He has every right to do that. That the king has the right to take counsel from whomever he wishes. He has the right to raise people to power in the way that he does. It's the magnates who turn Gaveston into a political issue. And of course, Edward is not going to give way in the same way that his father wouldn't, of you don't get to choose who my counsellors are. I get to decide that. You get to choose who your own counsellors are. I should have the right to choose who my counsellors are. And of course, it ends up with Gaveston being non-judicially executed, which of course everyone eventually has to recognise that was an illegal act. And the rest of Edward's reign, as you rightly pointed out earlier on, is essentially dealing with the consequences of what happens to Piers Gaveston. And then if you look at Richard II, and again, I agree absolutely that 1381, Richard sees this as his big entrance, his big moment of taking on kingship. And what happens to him in the immediate aftermath of that? The council around him puts him back in his box and say, oh, no, you can't be king yet. And you look back to 1377, what they do is they don't want a regent. They don't want John of Gaunt to be regent. They don't want a regency council. Instead, they say Richard is of age already at the age of 10, which is a complete, fiction. But what that does is it seeds the struggle that happens in the 1380s, which is Richard trying to actually become king, and people not letting him become king. So I just wanted to sort of to ask you to think a little bit about that.
Sorry,
So I completely disagree with Andrew on this.
Hey. We're in classic top territory, people.
Edward II may have had the perfect right to appoint Gaveston, but it was an act of monumental foolishness and stupidity, because no previous king had ever raised someone up from that level to make an earl, and not merely an earl of Cornwall, which had been in the royal family. Henry III made Hubert de Burgh Earl of Kent, and of course, look what he did. Yeah. If anyone deserved to be made Earl of Kent, it was Hubert de Burgh, after his huge services to the English crown. And equally, I mean, there's no precedent for that under Edward I. Edward I never made someone like that an earl. So it was an act of monumental folly, and so that's where everything went wrong from the start.
I mean, I was going to say, in which case you're both right. Andrew's right in that Edward does have, he's allowed to do what he likes. But David, you're also obviously right. And of course, Gaveston turns out to be toxic in terms of his personality, rubbing people up the wrong way. But going back to Andrew, I mean, he is exiled twice. But Edward is willing to give him up, at least temporarily. Now, of course, he doesn't want to give him up permanently. But, I know once is an honourable exile to Ireland, where actually he does do a lot of good. And the other one is, Flanders, whatever. But yeah, I mean, David, obviously you're right. I mean, Gaveston, the problem is Gaveston then becomes Edward's cause all the way through to the end of his reign. His wanting to wreak revenge. He gets it in 1322, but then it's still Gaveston in the background.
So, David.
Whereas Edward I made concessions to the realm for major political purposes in order to pursue wars in Scotland and Wales, Edward II is making major political concessions for no other purpose than to keep Gaveston by his side. I mean, it's just incredibly stupid. And actually, he was exiled 3 times, because Edward I had exiled him once. Edward I knew what folly this was.
Yeah, try Helen Carr.
So just in relation to response first to Andrew is, yes, I agree. Of course, he's allowed to do what he wants, but I also don't think it's necessarily the elevation of Gaveston to Earl of Cornwall. I agree with David, and I think that was a stupid thing to do, especially your first act as king. I mean, that is a ridiculous thing to do. But I think we need to look for what is the political stage that this can all play out on. Of course, it's Edward's coronation. And what does he do at his coronation? He gives Gaveston all of the leading roles. He allows him to wear all the colours that irritate everybody. He was said to have dressed as if the god Mars. And then the most appalling act was that he had Gaveston's arms next to his arms when they should have really... Where's Isabella's going to go? Where she was being crowned queen at the same time. So he's irking the French. Isabella's brother was there, and he was absolutely mortified at this display. And I think that we have to look at that as, what is this? That is the point. It's his coronation. And slightly before, when he's appointed Custos Regni so he's appointed as effectively regent whilst Edward goes to France to collect Isabella, that you start to see the nobility starting to be crossed. And we did mention the fact that a lot of these nobles were, Lancaster, for example, were signatories on this charter. So it's not necessarily the elevation to Earl of Cornwall. I think that was a kind of probably a bit of a side glance as to, okay, fine, well, let's let him do it, sort of attitude to his kingship. But I think it was everything that happened after that. And it started with, with a huge, great bang at the coronation. And I think that act in itself is an important one to consider. And yes, of course, Edward I exiled Gaveston because he could see all of this potentially becoming a problem in Edward's reign. And I did have another point, but I'm afraid I've completely forgotten it.
Sorry, there are more questions. Yeah.
Very, very quick one, I hope. We spent, and thank you for a really interesting discussion. We've spent quite a lot of time looking at two blokes at the either end of the century who, frankly, don't seem to be all that good at kinging.
True.
In the middle, there was Edward III, and he lost it a bit towards the end, maybe. But in the middle, there was Edward III. How did he develop being what seems to have been a good king? Where did he pick that up from? Why didn't people argue with him in the same way that they seem to fall out with the two seconds, as it were?
I think that Edward III had an extraordinary political acumen in the way that he was able to use propaganda and unity and develop this sense of unity and national identity and a national cause. And this was really manifested in the Order of the Garter, but he had a sort of an earlier device before the Order of the Garter, which was the Order of the Round Table, and that was set up at Windsor, and he was trying to create this sort of elitist fraternity of knights to really ensure that what had happened in his father's reign would not happen again. And he did this by giving these men something to aspire to, this sense of belonging, this idea that they are all in it together. And what's really interesting about the Order of the Round Table, and we know Edward modelled himself on Arthur, but he did not refer to himself initially as Arthur. He referred to himself as Sir Lionel, who was one of the Round Table knights. So he's sort of saying, I am one of you, so to speak. And that was very much his action going into the 100 Years' War as well. And so I think that he was incredibly successful in those terms of creating this political unity amongst his nobility and rewarding those who had served him well. And actually that brings me back to the point that I completely forgot in relation to what David said, which was, I was thinking of the Duke of Lancaster being another example of elevating somebody who is a close friend with a great title, but he deserved it because of his loyalty and because of his, he quite literally allowed himself to be taken prisoner so Edward could go and crack on with everything he needed to do in his war against the French. So he deserved, in Edward's mind, he deserved that mantle.
Just sorry, could I just one more local point? Of course, 1330, Roger Mortimer was executed. You would think Edward III would have got rid of the Earldom of March. He doesn't. He revives it under his much more successful grandson, waits for his time, and the Earldom of March actually survives and develops. Sorry, Philip.
Okay. No.
So in that respect, I think he was very successful at doing that. I have opposing opinions as to this idea that Edward III was the great king, because I don't actually think that he was.
We never got onto that, did we?
No.
We're not going to get onto it now as a
You
question.
can ask me later.
Okay, we've got time for just one last quick question. Yes?
Thank you. You don't mention the sexual narrative, which links both the two bad kingies and the Isabella interregnum, so to speak. Do you think that sort of hostile sexual narrative is a hostile interpretation of what might have been perceived as rational acts at the time, or do you think those rational acts among those four people were distorted by the sexual narrative?
It's a good question.
Yeah.
I think you've picked up on the fact that these rumours around Edward's sexuality seem to really appear after Isabella's invasion, while she was, trying to muster support for her cause. And I think they have to be considered in that vein and within that context. I can tell you what I think about Edward in relation to his sexuality and Richard's. I'm less confident on Richard, in all honesty, but Edward, I think that it was probably more of and there's been some more recent research on this by Savannah Pine, who's incredibly convincing, not in relation to Edward, but just the principle. And it's a ritual brotherhood. And I think that he did likely consider Piers Gaveston as a brother. And this makes sense in the context that this is a period where women were circumnavigated by men, and there was a closeness between them that would not look conventional for a heterosexual relationship by today's standards, but it's a sort of physical closeness and a loving nature that is more akin to a marriage. And I think that's how I think that he saw Piers. also because he continually referred to him as brother in the record as well. And of course, we can never truly know. With Richard, Robert de Vere is the point of Richard's interest. I think that's more obscure. I think Richard was quite incapable of having any sort of real love, both sexual or emotional, with anybody. And Helen Carr makes a pretty convincing argument that this is essentially why he didn't have an heir, because he couldn't consider having another person in his role, even if it was of his offspring. His mind just could not compute that. So I'm less sure in relation to Robert de Vere. I think de Vere was probably a similar, but less, I think, less formal than Edward and Gaveston. I think what had been modelled for them in literature of the time and in scripture as well, I think it is aligned to that principle of a ritual brotherhood.
But sorry, just to go to the point about the transition between the reigns and the sexual narrative there, both Ian Mortimer and Mark Ormerod wrote very persuasively on the sermons that were given in 1326 during the invasion by Adam Alton, Bishop of Hereford, who is very close to Roger Mortimer, of course, with a very strong implication of a sodomitical relationship of some kind. Now, that's obviously potentially not actually on fact, but it's a perception that they wanted to put about in order to, as another prop towards a potential deposition, and obviously what actually did happen to poor Hugh Despenser when he was not just emasculated but torn apart, and his sexual organs were ripped from him.
Exactly.
And burned, so.
And I think that's more in relation to Hugh Despenser than it is to Gaveston. But also I think the idea with the Brooke Chronicler and his assertion of the means of Edward's death as well, I think that the two have become conflated over time. And there has been some brilliant research to say that actually the sort of poker narrative was really it's mimetic literature. So it's a means and a device to evoke empathy and perhaps sort of titillation from the reader. And it actually, you see it in other myths of earlier a medieval period. I'm thinking of Edmund Ironside, who was allegedly killed when he went to the toilet, and a statue holding a bow and arrow just happened to release the arrow, and he died in the reigns that I'm going to leave to your imagination. And also, of course, the Viking on the bridge in 1066. It's sort of following this trope, but it was later in the 16th century actually that the two became conflated. This poker myth and also these sermons of sermons of sodomy, I think is the article's title. And it's a very interesting. It's very interesting, but I think what is more interesting is thinking in those terms. What is it that people in this period found evocative and tantalizing, and what is it they wanted to know? Because that is who these chroniclers are writing for in many ways.
And regretfully, I think we'll have to draw a line under it there.
On that note.
On that note. But huge thank you.